And if it falls on me, let's say maybe God's trying to tell me to be quiet. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Josh, if you don't know me, and I've got the honor of presenting the message this morning. Carrying on from where we have been moving through recently, looking at this idea, this theme of a year on our knees before God, and looking at some of the different ways as we look through Scripture, as we look at examples of reasons that people would kneel before another, such as God. We shifted. Does anyone remember what we looked at last week? You're welcome. Yes, gratitude. We looked at gratitude. And part of that was with gratitude. We decided to start with gratitude because in one sense it's foundational to have gratitude for others and before God, but also because as we go through and we look at what it means to kneel before God in different contexts, as we see hopefully more of his character in the way that he responds to this kneeling, we understand gratitude more. And so that's something we carry with us as we go through, which is good because this one is not one of my favorite ones, and that is to kneel in confession or repentance. It's also one of my favorites, but that's because of part 2. I remember... No, I'm going to change it slightly. There was a young boy once, and he was hanging out in the living room with his family, and particularly his sister and his dad, and they were playing some board games. It must have been a Saturday or something like that. And he had the call on what the next game was going to be. And so his dad sent him off to get the next game from the cupboard in his dad's office where it was kept. So he walked into his dad's office. It had the filing cabinet, the big desk covered in doodled notes and things like that. And then there was a shelf over on the side that had the precariously stacked shelf of board games. And he went over and he was allowed to come in to his dad's office to go to the bookshelf to get out a board game or something, but not to mess around with anything on his dad's desk or anything like that. I feel like I could probably stop the story now. We walked in, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw this magnificent, I don't even know what it was. It was it was like a silver eagle that was perched on top of this purple geode crystal thing. And it had been given to him as a gift, I happen to know, from a distance. Oh, thanks. Are you coming to listen, are you? Can you sit? But if you sit there, then I won't trip over you as often. You can turn around too. That's all right. No, that's fine. You can listen. Yeah, you want to sit down as well? This is going to be the most boring kids talk you've ever had. Magnificent thing. And I only seen it from a distance, obviously, because it was kind of eyes only, this kind of precious thing that sat on the desk. And as I walked in and I saw it, I thought, I haven't had a proper close-up look. And so, of course, this boy, he climbs up onto the seat, of his dad's chair, and he reaches over just to have a quick squiz, gentle, carefully picked it up. And without even really getting a proper look, it just slipped slightly, tapped the corner of the desk, and immediately broke into about 4 pieces on the table. Little eagle bumps off to the side. And can anyone maybe offer up some ideas of the feelings that went through this boy at the time? Any ideas? Horror, yes. Horror, yeah. Shock, yes. Shock. Maybe it was predictable to many, but this boy certainly felt it. Terror, yeah. I know what's coming, I know what the next step is. Yeah, Reuben. Absolutely. I know you haven't felt that feeling before, Reuben, but yes, scared that I was going to get into trouble. Disbelief. It took a while to connect because this couldn't really be real that this would happen. It's a grown-up thing. It's going to be sturdy, right? Yeah. I feel like that feeling of cold fear about what's going to happen that kind of starts at the top and washes through, and then a building rising up in the other way, hot shame, that comes from the opposite direction. And I think there's kind of these 3 things. There's the material cost, which has got to be, I'm estimating from my brain at that stage. I think the confession's out now. This was me. Sorry, Dad. No. That's the end of the story. The cold fear, what's going to happen to me? There's the material cost. How many weeks of pocket money? How many Star Wars action figures does this thing equate to in my economy, So there's the material costs. There's the fear about what's going to happen to me. The volume of the conversation that's oncoming. The tone, that horrible, disappointed look, that you've got coming. And then there's the shame. I know I shouldn't have been in here. I know I shouldn't have touched it. How sad is he going to be that this thing is broken? And who did he get? I don't even know who he got it from. What's the cost to him and our relationship? I'm thinking, okay, well, that's it. I'm probably not going to be able to come in here to go to the board game thing anymore, because how can he trust me? That trust is broken. He trusted me to come in and not touch it. So these three things have kind of layered on. Now you can imagine, as I headed out quietly and resumed my seat with whatever I brought out, Monopoly or something, I just grabbed the first thing I could grab. As I sat down, as I walked out and I looked at my dad, who, we've been laughing and joking around before, I did not feel like laughing and joking before. In fact, before, when I looked at him with love and joy and fun and lightheartedness, now I saw him and I felt stress. I felt coldness and fear. I felt distance. I felt worried. I felt anxious as I came and I silently sat. I kind of pushed it back a little way, but I think in some sense I knew the futility of the eventual discovery. I thought maybe there's a chance he'll never come in his office again for some reason, or there'd be an earthquake maybe and something would knock over, I don't know, some kind of justification. The cat would go in for a while, I could lock the door, and I don't know. But I sat down, but already, he didn't know anything about what had happened, but already our relationship was disconnected in a sense. I didn't want him to see me and know me anymore. And then, of course, my sister made some comment about, oh, you're funny, did something happen? And so, of course, I went off and yelled at her, who didn't deserve it, about that. And it all went on. And after a while, I excused myself and went off to my room to kind of sit there and try to figure out what to do. We'll come back to Josh later. But I think that's a story that I often think of when I think about, not that I haven't got other examples, the pain of I've stuffed up and how that can flow on so easily. And I thought I might unpack generally how that can look, the mechanics of how this kind of works out. I talked a little bit last week about how I had this picture of the old life and the new life, and sometimes that helps me kind of work through this stuff. So if we say this is the old life stuff, this is the way that stuff tends to run. This is a normal operation of the world we know. Old life is what I'm going to call it. There's lots of different names for this. Eagle touches down in the worst way possible, breaks. First thing jumps in is I've got this shame. I have let my dad down. There is guilt. I shouldn't have done it. I'm a terrible person. How does that then respond? Okay, well, now there's distance, maybe first thing I go to is self-justification. This thing is poorly made. I mean, who makes something that's this, And why was it on the desk where I could get up? And why did he even let me in here? He knows me better than this. So there's Now, I'll put this up here. Not everyone's necessarily going to be able to see it. I figure it'll help some, and it'll help me keep track as well. So I apologize if it's out of range, if my writing's too small. And maybe you can work on this if I come back to it. Self-justification. If it's small enough, you can't correct my spelling as well. Self-justification. What else? Well, I'm not in a headspace to deal with my sister's comments then, is there? So now there is competitiveness, or there's trying to put others down. Why? Because I'm down and they're trying to get me down, so I want them down too, so I feel a bit better. Because you know what she did the week before that's even worse than this? I don't have to say, but you get the point. So suddenly you're putting others down to get yourself up again. What kind of other stuff comes out? Suddenly there's a desire, if I want to get through in this world where things stuff up and I'm at a disadvantage and I'm at a point of fear, well, there's going to be distance. There's distance with other people. You get things like secrets and deception. You've got to try and puff yourself up. You've got to make everyone think that you're better than you are. So often you get pride. You try to kind of build up a presence for yourself. And along with that, there's also self-consciousness, So how often they go together? Self-consciousness and pride. We put on a mask. We're not really, when we relate to people, we're not all there. We're not able to actually offer ourselves up to people because no one's going to want to know us as we are. Short fuse, yeah. Yeah, you're on a snap. You've got costs because the whole time you're dealing with this weight of shame and fear of consequences. I'm not going to be able to afford. In retrospect, I had underestimated the value of that eagle. But even then, even with the estimation that we have of the consequences of our sin, it's bigger than the bank account. So yeah, we get anger and outbursts. You got a short fuse. The point is, you can kind of work on this and you can keep going out for a while. But these are kind of the things that come out really quickly and kind of stack and build on. And secrets themselves tend to kind of wind, and the fear of continuation, they tend to kind of wrap you up over time and get bigger and bigger, and that builds the shame. And all sorts of relationships break down and kind of crack apart. I think for me, one of the key things as I reflect in my own life, and when I think back to before I had a conception of grace, I've been obviously connected in with church for most of my life, but I was very aware, and I believe that most of us are inadequately, but sufficiently aware of the fact that we don't measure up and that we stuff up. And have often got, by a pretty early age, I'd say, a sense that if people really knew who I was and the kind of things I did, they probably wouldn't like me. If this came out at church, it might be the end. If my dad found out, well, what would he say? That'd be a breakdown in the relationship. And so this is distance. And sin has a tendency to pull towards isolating people. Like a lion trying to isolate someone from the pride. It's an isolating thing. Bonhoeffer talked about how in confession, the breakthrough to community takes place. Sin demands to have a man by himself. It withdraws him from the community. The more isolated a person is, the more destructive will be the power of sin over him. And that was my experience. In the midst of Christian community and good family and all the rest of it, in retrospect, none of the relationships that I had with anyone, with friends, with family, at church, Bible studies, none of them were connected with me because all of them were held at bay by the mask that I had to put up in fear that they would really know that actually I'm not quite making the cut. That actually deep down, I'm not a good Christian. I'm not actually good enough. I'm not worth being here. And if I'd been willing to admit it, I would have realized that that was my attitude towards God as well. If I can just kind of sort myself out, if I can just make up the money before Dad finds out about the eagle, then I can buy a new one, or I can pay him back, or it'll be okay. And there'll be no need for him to be angry. There'll be no breakdown in relationship. But you can never get there. And the more it goes on, and you realize it doesn't, the shame builds and it becomes a cycle, and you become more and more isolated and disconnected. I thought it was magnificent, John's communion talk about the light versus darkness, that God seeks us out and finds us. And that is my testimony as well. I remember, and I've told this story many times, of working through this stuff and trying to get there. And for me, it was my brother who finally broke through and said, is there something going on for you? Is there a particular thing that's happening? He recently, in a big way, come to faith. He'd kind of that's a much better story for another time. But he really pressed in, and he really wanted to know what's actually going on. How are you actually going? And finally, in tears, I shared. And it was not everything, but it was a crack into who I felt like I really was. And so he yelled at me for times I'd stuffed up. No, he didn't. He took it. And he said, you know what? That's like, I've been there too, but you know what? God can handle that. Tell me more. Like, share more about where you're at. I can take it. I can handle it. And he kind of took that. And that was the start, I'd say, of my process of moving towards where I am now in faith. And that kind of, those conversations happened over time, working through, until I got to the point where I remember I was sitting there vacuuming one day talking about this stuff, and I heard this song that was playing. My sister had given me this cheesy Christian playlist, and there was this song by, can't even remember the name of the guy, but it's a song. It's from Peter's perspective. It's a Christian song, and he's talking about how Jesus has died. He betrayed him. As Peter did, he denied him 3 times. There's no way around it. He stuffed up big time. He directly denied Christ 3 times, and now Jesus is dead. And he's pacing around his room. This is in this song. It's kind of it projects this space, this imagined space. He's walking around and he's saying, it doesn't even matter. Even if Jesus was alive, it actually doesn't matter because I betrayed him, and it can never be the same again. I betrayed him into death. And then in the song, Jesus appears before him, and his arms are open, and he looks into his eyes, and he looks into his eyes, and he saw the forgiveness that was in his eyes. And then it goes into the chorus and it said, he's alive, he's alive, he's alive and I'm forgiven. Heaven's gates are open wide. And in my head, I said, well, that's okay, but they've missed a step there. He's alive, he's forgiven. I'll get my act together and then I'll be a good Christian. And then maybe heaven's gates will be open and I'll be right to get in there. But it wasn't there. There was nothing there. There was no gap there. And I felt in my heart, no, that's it. You're forgiven right now. Peter, as he is on the floor, hasn't said sorry, hasn't gone back and beat up the Romans. He hasn't done anything to buy himself back. Right then, all the way to heaven's gates are open wide. Like, that's it. There's nothing else there. There's no more work that can be done or should be done. In fact, the idea that there still is work to be done becomes a gate that we put up by ourselves. There's nothing else. Heaven's gates are open wide. And then and all I could do was think, well, that doesn't make sense. Why? How could that be? Why? What have I done? How could I have earned this? There must be more that has to be paid. But it was all covered. I didn't even understand the scope of it. But that was the beginning of a life that began to work towards fullness and openness in other things. As all this stuff begins to be unwound, suddenly it's been paid for. If I can come before God, if I'm worthy as I am to go to heaven, well then this stuff is taken care of. The guilt and the shame, he's taken that. I'm set, I'm good now. Well now, I don't need to self-justify. I break the thing. All right, the cost has been paid. I better go and confess. The fear. So fear drives a lot of these things. If I've got the hope, the certain hope of salvation, what is fear? Perfect love drives out fear. If this fear is gone, well, I don't need to self-justify. I don't need to why am I putting people down? If the price is paid, there's no comparison. I don't need to put other people down to get my economy back up to somewhere where I can survive anymore because I'm covered. It's already been paid. Or can I do? Why wouldn't I just lift other people up? Why wouldn't I forgive that? Suddenly I can afford it. I can afford to pay out these massive bills because of what's coming into my bank account. It's flooded. I can't overspend anymore. Well, then why wouldn't I pay out the debts that are coming in against me as well? What about secrets and deceptions? Well, before God, I can do that too. Where before, kneeling before God in confession was such a painful thing. Now, it's still pretty terrible. I know that experience. But coming before God, I come before God knowing that it's going to become handled. Instead of this cycle that goes on and on and on and deepens in shame, I'm getting better over time. I'm getting better at earlier in that process, coming back and going, all right, actually, you know what? I know where this goes, but I know what you've done. All right. God, this is what I've done. I'm sorry. I want you to take it. Thank you for what Jesus did. And there's consequences. The consequences still remain of the things that I've done. But God doesn't just promise to connect back and pay the price of the broken relationship. He doesn't just promise to deal with our sin and the shame, but he also walks with us as we deal with the consequences that come afterwards. And more than that, the negative consequences of sin don't just kind of get paid back to the dollar, but they get redeemed and become greater things. So I went back to the office, this little boy who was actually me, and I sat there trying to think, is there any way that sticky tape could possibly... And then my dad came in, said, "Oh, how you doing? What are you up to?" "Oh, nothing, you know." And then, eventually I got to that point. I was like, "Look, Dad, I just had a quick look at it. I barely touched it, and it broke." And he said, "Oh, you barely touched it?" I was like, "Okay, well, I picked it up, and I dropped it, but it just tapped the table, and it broke into pieces." And he didn't blink an eye. He said, "That's all right. I've got some super glue. I think we can fix this. Come on, let's sit down and fix it." And he chatted happily while we fixed it and glued it and put it back up, and we were set and we were right. And this cost was gone. In fact, I felt closer to my dad then than I had before. And he knew where I was at. He knew me. He knew my heart. He could see the pain that I was in. He knew the suffering. But he could pay the cost of the object, and he was willing to pay the cost to buy back the relationship because he wanted that with me. I think about my own relationship with my kids. It's not always that nice. I don't always demonstrate that level of grace, and sometimes more is required, in loving them. But it was a picture for me of the way that grace can work to redeem. I had a couple of other quick points that I wanted to make. The first one is, so confession is a good thing. That's my short point for that bit there. The second thing I wanted to quickly talk about was confession not to God, so confession in other places. The first one that I wanted to talk about was confession in terms of the consequences of our sin. And I alluded to this before. One thing that we have is not just in the airy-fairy spiritual world of confession and sin, but in the practical world of confession. And we see this in the scriptures as well, where people would confess and then they would diligently work through the consequences of their actions, whether that meant prison time, whether that meant paying back more than they could afford, whether that meant going and dealing with the berating and the hurt from other people, but being able to confess, because even if the physical life consequences are more than we can pay, God has called us to be representatives of truth and restorers of relationship, and to trust that he can also deal with the heavy other consequences that do still persist, that are real in this world and may cause damage until all things are brought back under God. And I think as Christians, we have an obligation when we are faced with sin and pain in the world to confront it with more honesty and more forthrightness and more eagerness to make things right than the world can understand, because the world is operating out of this. And if we're operating out of this, which I forgot to write up the list, but I'm sure you can remember it, out of an overflow of love and generosity and giving, then even when we've stuffed up and acted out of this, we're not then going to continue on and move into secrets and deception and trying to minimize the costs that we've got to pay back. But as a church and as Christians, we actually need to, we're here, we stuff up out of here. Well, what do? Then we then have to come back over here and be up front. And how often have you seen that, where someone stuffs up and then they turn around and go, "It was me, I did it, and I'll do whatever I need to do to set this right, to do this right." And you think, well, that's not natural. That's not of this world when people do that. I think even that means that that God can redeem evil for good. I say that very lightly and skimming through theology, not having in my life had to pay too many really heavy consequences. So I lay that there for your own examination. Number 2, James, confess therefore to one another. In community as Christians, we are called not just to confess to God, but to confess to one another. What's the point in that? So we are called to do it. It is something that we have to do. It's something that we're called to do. And I believe that it is part of our duty as Christians to help others to be released from shame and guilt. And sometimes in the speaking of the shame that holds us, it is broken. Light comes in, and that is a painful experience. But confession to God, I think, is number one. And no one can come between us and God in confession. But God can be present and represented and manifest to us through other Christians. I think that's one of the key ways that he represents himself to us. For me, my brother, being able to confess my sin explicitly to my brother was Christ to me. That was God's work in me. If you are holding something and it has weight over you that persists in the shame and guilt of who you are, confession to God and confession to a trusted other Christian is magnificently powerful. It is a significant and powerful thing that I commend to you. If you don't know someone who can do that, I can do that. There are trusted people who have been appointed in this church who you can talk to, and I can help point you in certain directions, even if you don't connect with me. And I think the last thing is, a warning that comes with this. In Genesis, they're walking in the garden, and what kind of outfits were they wearing? You can't say that in church. That's right. They were naked, walking with God. That's not because clothes hadn't been invented yet. I don't believe that's because they just hadn't got around to it yet. I believe that was actually the right amount of clothes to wear in perfect, wholesome community. And I'm not suggesting that we don't wear clothes to church because we're in a Christian community, even on really hot days. That's not what I'm suggesting. And why not? Well, we laugh because we know that doesn't work. We can't do that. That's not okay. Is that because there's inadequacy in the wholeness towards God? Is that because there's a gap in our own holiness when God has healed us? In a sense, yes, we are still in a fallen world. And there is a cost to that level of vulnerability and intimacy that is actually often unwise. You think about, I've been toying with an idea of doing a message on modesty. But the idea that to reveal, if a relationship is me revealing myself to someone else, socially or whatever, and them revealing back to me, and the wholeness of that revelation is the quality of the relationship, then in the same way as with modesty, as we reveal ourselves, it is both profound vulnerability, it is also, in a sense, profound invitation to intimacy and connection. We have to have wisdom in this fallen, broken world with who we do that with and how we do that. And that goes for confession as well. Pearls before swine. There are people who, if you confess to them, are not in a place where they can receive it here, and so they can respond out of here and cause greater issues. I was talking with someone yesterday, a teenage guy, who was disconnected from the church because he said the church was a place for them to lay shame upon shame. And that obviously broke my heart. That's the opposite of what it's about. You need to have wisdom about where and when you confess, but that's no excuse not to do it. You just have to show wisdom about who is someone who's going to receive this not with condemnation, but with forgiveness and grace and encouragement. The Spirit of God will not layer upon shame and call you to isolation and call you to greater pain. The Spirit of God and grace will always call you, and it might be painful, but towards greater relationship, greater honesty, greater wholeness, and greater goodness. So it always calls you up, even if it's painful. Easiness, I think the spirit of accusation will draw you down and away and to greater pain, but it's often easier. I think that's one of the ways that I try to discern when I'm figuring that out. And the final part of this is we have a responsibility when we receive confession and as we respond to sin, if we are not called directly to call someone towards better action, to receive confessions of pain and sin and difficulty with grace and with love and with accommodation. And if we fail in this regard, we can become an obstacle between people and God. And this is, I think, a critical role that we play and a critical failing that we can have if we respond to people's confessed pain and suffering with shame and judgment. We can build obstacles between people and God, and we have to consider that very carefully in the way that we do these things. So that's a final thing that I wanted to share.